Collins Community Bank. Tuesday morning. A woman is staring at a document designed to erase her. My name is Beatrice Collins, and while the town outside sees my family as local royalty, I am standing in the fluorescent glare realizing I have become their sacrifice. There are no shouts, no guns, just a quiet crisis plan on a mahogany table that lists everyone but me. My father believes I am the spare part he can discard to save his reputation. He thinks I will go quietly into the dark. He forgot that I am the one who controls the lights. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The day my parents tried to erase me started like any other staff meeting. I was standing in the fluorescent-lit conference room of Collins Community Bank, staring down at a glossy packet on the mahogany table. It was titled, Crisis Communications Strategy, bound in the heavy, expensive cardstock my mother always insisted on for board meetings. I flipped through the pages, scanning the organizational charts and the chain of command for emergency protocols. My father's name was there naturally, right at the top in bold letters, Douglas Collins, President. My brother's name was there too, Ryan Collins, VP of Community Outreach. Even my mother, who held no official position other than wife of the president, was listed as a liaison for charitable partners. But I wasn't there. I checked the index, then the appendix. Nothing. I was the lead cybersecurity analyst, the person responsible for dragging this bank's archaic systems into the 21st century. Yet in the event of a crisis, I didn't exist. At the time, I thought it was just another oversight, another moment of invisibility in a lifetime of them. I didn't realize that the crisis plan wasn't missing my name by accident. It was missing my name because I was the crisis. In our town, the name Collins was practically royalty. We lived in a pocket of America where heritage still functioned like currency, a tight-knit, mildly conservative community where the bank wasn't just a business, it was the heartbeat of the local economy. My grandfather had built the place on the principles of hard work, family first, and reputation. My father Douglas had inherited that mantle and wore it like a tailored suit. To the town, he was a deacon, a pillar of the community, the man who shook your hand at the diner and asked about your sick mother. He preached the gospel of American values, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and standing by your kin. But from where I stood inside the house on the hill, those values were warped. Family first really meant image first. Hard work was something expected of me, while reputation was something bought for my brother. I was 28, single, and arguably the most qualified person on the payroll. I had left a high-paying job in the city to come back home driven by a pathetic, lingering hope that if I just made myself useful enough, my family would finally see me. I was the practical one, the spare daughter. I fixed the Wi-Fi. I balanced the checkbooks. I stayed late to patch the servers, while my brother Ryan, the golden child and ex-college football star, left early to drink scotch with potential clients. Ryan was the VP of Community Outreach, which was a fancy way of saying he was paid a six-figure salary to be charming and cover up his mistakes. I had a history of dating men who acted just like my father, controlling, emotionally withholding men who treated my competence as a convenience rather than a virtue. I suppose I was just trying to solve the puzzle of my father through them trying to earn love through labor. I remembered being 12 years old, crouching under my father's massive oak desk, rewiring his hard drive after a virus wiped out a major client presentation. I worked for 3 hours, sweating in my school uniform until I recovered every file. When he came in and saw the screen glowing restored, he didn't hug me. He turned to Ryan, who was throwing a tennis ball against the wall, and said, "Good thing your sister is handy." He never looked at me. He just looked at the screen. That was the dynamic. I was the mechanic in the engine room. They were the captains on the deck. I was necessary, but I wasn't part of the portrait. That need to be useful was exactly what led me to the anomalies. A few weeks prior, I had started noticing strange discrepancies in the bank's transaction logs. It wasn't sloppy code, it was deliberate obfuscation. Loan accounts were being opened and closed at 3 a.m. times when the bank was empty. There were override commands authorized by admin privileges that shouldn't have been active. The data didn't make sense. It looked like money was being moved in circles, washed through shell accounts before vanishing or reappearing as consulting fees. I took it to my father immediately. I walked into his office expecting him to be concerned, maybe even proud of my diligence. Instead, he didn't even look up from his paperwork. "Don't go chasing ghosts in the code, Beatrice," he said, his voice smooth and dismissive. "The bank is fine. You're overthinking it as usual. Stick to the firewall updates." He waved me off like I was a fly buzzing near his ear. He wasn't worried. That should have terrified me, but I was so used to being dismissed that I just swallowed the unease and went back to my desk. But the unease didn't leave. It sat in my gut like a stone. And then the call came. It wasn't an email or a calendar invite. It was a text from my mother sent at 4:45 p.m. on a Friday. "Come to the house tonight, 7 p.m., family meeting. Don't be late." My father's voice had been off all day, too calm, too precise. When I left the bank, he didn't say goodbye. He just watched me walk to the elevator, with a look I couldn't place. It wasn't anger. It was something colder. Resignation. Calculation. I drove to my parents' estate, the tires crunching on the gravel driveway that cost more than my first car. The house was lit up like a beacon, the curtains drawn tight. I parked my car and sat for a moment, checking my reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked tired. I told myself this was probably about Ryan. Maybe he'd crashed another car or gambled away another month's salary. I told myself I was there to fix it, just like always. I walked up the front steps, the heavy wood door unlocking before I even reached for my keys. I walked into my parents' living room expecting a conversation. I didn't know I was walking into an ambush. The living room felt less like a home and more like a courtroom where the verdict had been decided before the gavel ever banged. My parents sat side by side on the cream-colored sofa, their posture rigid, hands folded in their laps. My brother Ryan leaned against the stone fireplace, swirling a tumbler of amber liquid, refusing to meet my eyes. In the center of the coffee table, a single thick manila folder sat like a landmine. The silence in the room wasn't peaceful. It was heavy and suffocating, the kind of air that precedes a tornado. It had the hushed, rehearsed solemnity of a play where everyone knew their lines except for me. I was the last actor to arrive, stepping onto a stage I didn't recognize. "Sit down, Beatrice," my father said. It wasn't a request. I sat in the armchair opposite them, my knees pressed together, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "What is this? Is everyone okay?" Douglas didn't answer immediately. He leaned forward and opened the folder with agonizing slowness. He fanned out the contents: printed emails, screenshots of system logs, and photocopies of wire transfers. I squinted at them upside down. I recognized the interface. It was the bank's back-end system. "We received notice this afternoon," Douglas said, his voice terrifyingly even. "Federal regulators have flagged a series of fraudulent loans and illicit transfers. They are launching a full investigation into the bank's solvency and internal controls." "Okay," I said, my mind racing to the anomalies I had tried to show him days ago. "I told you, Dad. I told you there were ghosts in the code. We can fix this. I can isolate The investigation isn't into a ghost, Beatrice." He interrupted, his eyes cold and hard as flint. "It's into you." He tapped a finger on a highlighted log entry. "These unauthorized overrides, they were executed using your admin credentials. The emails coordinating the transfers sent from your IP address. According to this evidence, you have abused your administrative privileges to embezzle funds, threatening the stability of this bank and putting this family at extreme risk." The room seemed to tilt. My ears started to ring a high-pitched whine that drowned out the crackle of the fire. "What? No. That's impossible." I reached for the papers, but he slapped his hand down on them. "I didn't do this. Look at the timestamps, Dad. 3:00 a.m. I wasn't even in the building. I don't have remote access to that specific server partition. And those emails, the syntax isn't even mine. Anyone with a packet sniffer could have spoofed my MAC address if the firewall was down, which I warned you about last month. I looked at my mother. She was staring at a spot on the carpet, her face a mask of tragic endurance. Mom, you know I didn't do this. Beatrice, please, she whispered, her voice trembling with a fragility that felt manufactured. Don't make this harder than it already is. The ringing in my ears grew louder. I looked at Ryan. He took a long sip of his drink, his jaw tight. The narrative settled over me like a suffocating blanket. They weren't asking me if I did it. They were telling me I was going to take the blame for it. This wasn't a talk. I was being ambushed by my own parents. I won't confess to something I didn't do, I said, my voice rising, desperate to break the scripted reality they were weaving. I will show the regulators the truth. I'll show them the real logs. Douglas sat back, dropping the pretense of the concerned patriarch. The mask slipped, revealing the ruthless businessman beneath. You need to understand something, Beatrice. The truth is complicated. The regulators need a head on a platter. If they dig too deep, they destroy the bank. They destroy your brother's career. They destroy our legacy. So you want me to go to jail for Ryan? I asked, the realization hitting me with the force of a physical blow. Because he's the one who needed the money, isn't he? That's where the loans went. Douglas didn't flinch. He looked at me with a terrifying, pitying clarity. In a crisis, someone has to be sacrificed. And between the future of this bank, your brother and you were always the one we could afford to lose. The words landed like a physical strike to the chest. I felt something shatter inside me, the last fragile piece of the little girl who just wanted her father to say, "Good job." He hadn't just insulted me, he had quantified my worth to 0. Be reasonable, sweetie, my mother added, finally looking up with wet eyes. Think of the family. If you fight this, it ruins us all. She was weaponizing the word family, twisting it into a shackle. Here is the deal, Douglas said, his tone businesslike now. You sign a confession admitting to improper access and creating system vulnerabilities due to negligence. In exchange, we have arranged a plea. The regulators go light on the bank. You get probation, maybe a fine which we will pay. The Collins name stays clean. And if I don't? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Then I testify that you acted alone, Douglas said. I will hand them every piece of this fabricated evidence. I will have you arrested, prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, and I will cut you off completely. I will erase you from this family, Beatrice. You will have no money, no name, no home. Erase me. The threat hung in the air, chilling and dehumanizing. Douglas reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a fountain pen. He slid a typed document across the coffee table right next to the folder. He leaned back, steepled his fingers, and said almost kindly, "Sign it, and we all walk away from this." I looked down at my own name on the confession and realized they'd already decided I didn't deserve to walk away at all. I didn't sign the paper, I didn't scream, and I didn't flip the table. I simply stood up my legs, feeling like they belonged to someone else, and walked out of the house while my father called my name in that sharp, commanding bark he used for unruly dogs. I drove back to my apartment in a fugue state, the road blurring into streaks of red and yellow light. When I parked, the silence of my car hit me harder than the shouting had. I looked down at the plastic ID badge clipped to my blouse, Beatrice Collins, lead analyst, and felt a sudden violent revulsion. I ripped it off, snapping the plastic clip, and threw it onto the passenger seat. I sat there for 20 minutes, gripping the steering wheel, hyperventilating until the edges of my vision went gray. But as the panic crested, it didn't leave me hollow. It condensed. The terror cooled into a dense, heavy knot of focus in the center of my chest. They wanted a scapegoat. They forgot they were trying to frame the person who built their firewalls. The next morning, my mother asked to meet. She chose a small, neutral coffee shop on the edge of town, far enough from the bank that we wouldn't be interrupted by well-wishers. She looked immaculate, as always, her pearls perfectly aligned, but her hands were shaking as she stirred her tea. I waited for an apology. I waited for her to tell me that Dad had gone crazy, that she was going to fix it. You have to understand the position we're in. She started, her voice low and pleading. Sometimes sweetie parents have to make hard choices to protect the family. We can't lose the bank. Your father can't lose his reputation. Ryan can't lose his job. Someone has to take the weight. She didn't finish the sentence, but the words hung in the air between us. Someone has to be sacrificed. Why me? I asked, looking at the woman who had taught me to tie my shoes, who had nursed me through fevers. Why is it okay to destroy my life to save Ryan's? Elaine reached across the table, trying to take my hand. I pulled back. She sighed, a sound of martyred patience. Because you're strong, Beatrice. You always have been. You'll survive this. You'll land on your feet somewhere else. She paused, her eyes searching mine for agreement. Your brother. He wouldn't survive prison. He's not like you. The second wound was deeper than the first. My father had told me I was expendable because I had no value. My mother was telling me I was expendable because I had too much value. My competence, my resilience, my strength. These were not reasons to cherish me. They were the very reasons I was the perfect victim. I was the sturdy furniture they could afford to burn to keep the golden child warm. I left her there with her tea and drove home with a new kind of clarity. That night, I didn't drink and I didn't cry. I went to my closet and pulled out a shoebox from the top shelf. Inside was an external hard drive, my paranoid backup. I had made a habit of mirroring the server logs to a personal offline drive every week, a best practice for disaster recovery that my father had mocked as a waste of time. Now, it was my ammunition. I booted up my laptop and plugged in the drive. I started cross-referencing the fraudulent overrides my father had shown me against the unaltered history on my drive. The discrepancies were glaring. The overrides didn't come from my account. They traced back to a secondary admin profile, DC Emerg01. It was the emergency access account Douglas had insisted on having created years ago, claiming he needed to be able to monitor the shop at all hours. I dug deeper. The money wasn't just vanishing into Ryan's gambling debts, though plenty of it was. There were massive structured loans being pushed through to shell LLCs with vague names like Cornerstone Development and Heritage Holdings. I ran the tax IDs. They connected to Ryan, yes, but also to Douglas's biggest political donors, a prominent town council member, and the developer currently gentrifying the low-income neighborhood on the south side. My father wasn't just covering for his son, he was running a community-scale fraud ring. He was using the depositors' money, the savings of the teachers, the mechanics, the nurses of this town to bankroll his friends' risky ventures. I sat back, the glow of the screen illuminating my dark living room. This wasn't just a family mess. If I stayed silent, if I signed that confession, I wasn't just saving my skin. I was letting them rob the entire town. I thought about the family values my father preached from the pulpit. They were lies. The real values, fairness, accountability, justice, were things I had to fight for alone. I minimized the evidence window. I opened the file containing the draft confession Douglas had emailed me. I hovered over the print icon, then hit delete. I opened a fresh notepad file. My fingers hovered over the keys. I wasn't going to write a defense. I was going to write a trap. I began coding a fail-safe disclosure script, a digital dead man's switch. Just as I typed the first line of code, my phone buzzed on the desk. It was a text from an unknown number. We know you're hesitating. You have 48 hours to sign, or this gets much worse. My blood ran cold. I stood up and walked to the window, peering through the blinds. Across the street, a dark sedan was idling its headlights off the engine, humming low in the quiet night. They were watching me. That was the night I understood something simple and terrifying. My own family wasn't just willing to sacrifice me, they were willing to threaten me into it. I knew I couldn't fight a war on two fronts, my family and the federal government alone. I needed allies, people who existed outside the gravitational pull of the Collins distortion field. The first call I made was to Marcus Diaz. Marcus was a reporter for the regional paper, but before that he had been my high school debate partner and the almost boyfriend I had pushed away because he didn't fit into my father's picture of appropriate. We met at a 24-hour diner on the highway, a place where the coffee tasted like burnt rubber, and nobody cared who the Collins family was. I sat in the booth, my hands shaking so hard I had to grip my chipped mug with both palms to keep the liquid from sloshing over the rim. I told him everything: the ambush, the threat, the shell companies, the car watching my apartment. I expected skepticism. Instead, Marcus just nodded, his face grim. "I knew it," he muttered. "I've been trying to find a crack in the bank's financials for 2 years. It was always too clean on paper, too perfect." He reached across the table, covering my shaking hands with his steady ones. "I can help you, B. But you need to know if we pull this thread, the whole sweater unspools. Once this hits daylight, your last name will never mean the same thing again." "Good," I said, surprised by how much I meant it. My second stop was a 2-hour drive to the city to see the only person who had ever successfully escaped Douglas Collins, his sister, my Aunt Gloria. She lived in a cramped, book-filled apartment that smelled of old paper and peppermint tea. Gloria had been the bank's compliance officer 15 years ago until she clashed with Douglas over what he called ethical gray areas, and she called fraud. She had left town and never looked back. When I showed her the data on my hard drive, she didn't look shocked. She looked vindicated. She put on her reading glasses, scanning the raw logs with professional scrutiny. "This is it, Beatrice," she said, her voice sharp. "But listen to me. If you sign that confession, your life is over. You'll have a felony record. You'll never work in security again. Douglas is counting on your fear." She looked up, her expression fierce. "Your only play is to make the evidence undeniable and public. You can't just leak it. You have to detonate it." She offered to be a secure endpoint for my data, promising to route it directly to her contacts at the FDIC and the State Attorney General's office the moment I gave the signal. I drove back to my apartment with a plan taking shape in the architecture of my mind. I was done reacting. It was time to execute. I spent the next 12 hours, fueled by caffeine and adrenaline, writing the most important code of my life. I designed a script that would sit silently in the bank system, monitoring the admin logs. It was a digital tripwire. I set it to trigger on a specific action: the usage of Douglas's emergency admin profile to authorize a document. I knew he would use that account to finalize my confession in the system, bypassing the standard checks. The script was designed to do two things simultaneously. First, it would compile every incriminating audit trail, every altered log, and every email detailing Ryan's debts and Douglas's orders into an encrypted package. It would blast this package to a distribution list that included federal regulators, the FDIC, Aunt Gloria Marcus's encrypted email, and the local news desk. Second, and this was for me, it would hijack the presentation software in the main boardroom. Around 3:00 a.m., I took a break. I sat on my floor, surrounded by takeout containers and old photo albums. I found a picture of us from a Christmas party years ago, Douglas with his hand on Ryan's shoulder, beaming. I was in the background, half out of frame, holding the coats. I heard his voice in my head again. "You were always the one we could afford to lose." A wave of grief hit me, sharp and sudden. I wasn't just destroying a bank. I was severing the only roots I had ever known. But then I looked at the dark sedan still parked across the street. They had already tried to erase me. I wasn't destroying my family. I was simply refusing to disappear for them. The next morning, Douglas called. He sounded impatient. "We're scheduling the final meeting for tomorrow morning at the bank. Have you come to your senses?" I forced my voice to tremble. I made myself sound small, defeated, the daughter he thought he knew. "Yes, Dad. I'm tired. I just want it to be over." "Good girl," he said, the satisfaction in his voice making my skin crawl. "Be at the boardroom at 9:00 a.m. We'll have the lawyers there to witness the signature." I hung up and turned back to my laptop. I ran the simulation one last time. The code was clean. It was a perfect trap, waiting for a predator to step on the plate. On my screen, a red message box flashed, pulsing like a heartbeat in the dark room. Ready. Awaiting trigger. I closed the laptop and stared at the reflection of my own eyes in the black screen. The last time my parents ambushed me, I didn't see it coming. Tomorrow they'll walk straight into mine. The main boardroom of Collins Community Bank was designed to intimidate. A massive mahogany table dominated the center of the room, polished to a mirror shine, flanked by high-backed leather chairs that squeaked with self-importance. In the corner, a large American flag hung limp on a brass pole, and at the head of the room, a projection screen descended from the ceiling like a guillotine blade. When I walked in, the cast was already assembled. Douglas sat at the head of the table, flanked by my mother, and a slick-haired attorney I didn't recognize. Two members of the board men who had known me since I was a child sat further down, looking uncomfortable. The atmosphere wasn't tense. It was disturbingly calm. There was a palpable sense of relief in the air, the relaxed shoulders of people who believed the unpleasantness was merely procedural now. To them, this wasn't a trial. It was just the paperwork before they could go back to their country club lunches. Douglas stood up as I entered, buttoning his suit jacket. He didn't smile, but his expression was soft, almost benevolent. He gestured to the empty chair at the foot of the table. "Have a seat, Beatrice. We're just about ready to put this behind us." I sat, letting my shoulders slump. I kept my eyes on the table, performing the role of the broken daughter. Douglas took this as a cue to deliver one last sermon. "I want you to know," he said, his voice dropping to that deep, resonant timbre he used for church readings, "that we are doing this to save the community. Think about the families who depend on us, the tellers, the loan officers, their children. If the regulators shut us down, those people lose everything. You'd burn all that down just to save yourself. That isn't who we are. That isn't American." He was framing my refusal as selfish, twisting his own corruption into a virtue. I forced a tremor into my hands, clasped tight in my lap. "I know," I whispered, barely audible. "I don't want to hurt anyone." "Then let's get this done," the attorney said, sliding a tablet toward me. "The confession is loaded. You just need to digitally sign, and your father will authorize the submission to the board's record." I looked up, eyes wide and watery. I can't," I stammered. "My hands are shaking too much. I can't read the text on that small screen. Can I just read it off the main projector? Please, I just want to get it right." Douglas sighed, checking his watch. "Fine, go to the console." I walked to the laptop connected to the projector system. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, but my fingers were steady as I touched the keyboard. I logged in. The screen behind me lit up, displaying the document, "Formal Admission of Guilt, Beatrice Collins." "Okay," I said, stepping back. "I'm ready. You just need to authorize the final version, Dad." Douglas walked over, annoyed by the delay. He leaned over the keyboard, blocking my view of the board members. "You're making a scene, Beatrice," he muttered under his breath. He typed his password into the prompt, the password for the emergency admin account. He hit enter. That was the trigger. The screen flickered violently. The confession document dissolved, replaced by a black terminal window with scrolling green text. Douglas froze, his finger still hovering over the enter key. "What did you do?" he hissed. On the massive projection screen, the text stopped scrolling and locked onto a series of system logs. They were magnified, impossible to miss. User DC/emerge01. Action override loan limit. Time 02:14 a.m. Then another. Transfer approved $500,000 to Shell Corp A7. Then the emails appeared. They popped up one after another like flashcards. One dated 3 months ago, from Douglas to Ryan, read, "Don't worry about the audit trail. Use Beatrice's credentials. If this blows back, she's our failsafe." A gasp tore through the room. I looked at Elaine. Her hand was over her mouth, her eyes wide with a horror that was finally real. The board members were standing up, staring at the screen. "Turn it off!" Douglas shouted, slamming his hand onto the laptop. But the script was already executing the next command. The room's surround sound speakers crackled, and then a voice filled the air. It was clear, high-fidelity audio captured from my smartwatch during the ambush. In a crisis, someone has to be sacrificed. You were always the one we could afford to lose. Douglas's voice echoed off the mahogany walls, indicting him in his own tone of arrogant certainty. He looked wild now, lunging for the projector cable, yanking it from the wall. The screen went dark, but it didn't matter. A final notification had already flashed, evidence distributed to FDIC state, AG, federal regulators, Collins community staff, regional press. At that exact moment, phones started buzzing. The attorney's phone, the board members' phones, even Marcus's phone out in the hallway. The buzz was a collective swarm of truth arriving all at once. "It's a fake!" Douglas screamed, turning to the board members, his face purple with rage. "She hacked the system. She fabricated all of it. She's trying to destroy me." I stood by the console, no longer slumping. I straightened my spine, looking him dead in the eye. The silence that followed his scream was absolute. "If I'm such an incompetent screw-up, Dad," I said, my voice steady and cold, "how did I manage to fake your passwords, your emails, and your voice?" One of the board members, a man who had golfed with my father for 20 years, picked up the conference phone. "Get security in here," he said, his voice flat. "And call the regulators. Tell them we have a situation." Security arrived within seconds. They hesitated, looking between the bank president and the board, until the board member pointed at Douglas. As they took his arms, Douglas didn't look at them. He looked at me. "You've destroyed the family," he screamed as they dragged him toward the double doors. "You ungrateful child, you'll regret this forever." I didn't watch him leave. I walked out the side door into the main lobby. The bank was silent. Every teller, every loan officer, every customer was staring at their phone or their computer screen, reading the mass email I had just sent. As I walked through the center of the room, heads turned. For the first time in my life, when people whispered the name Collins, they weren't just talking about him, they were looking at me. The days following the boardroom explosion were a blur of flashing lights and shutter clicks. News trucks from the state capitol camped out on the curb where my father used to park his luxury sedan. Their satellite dishes pointed like accusing fingers at the limestone facade of the bank. It didn't take long for the regulators to move from investigation to execution. The FDIC seized control of Collins Community Bank within 48 hours, freezing accounts and slapping padlocks on the doors. The headlines were relentless. Douglas Collins was indicted on 17 counts, including bank fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. My brother Ryan was implicated as a knowing participant, his golden boy image tarnished forever by mugshots that looked confusingly like the yearbook photos of a man who still didn't understand why the rules applied to him. The community reaction was a fissure that ran straight down the middle of the town. Half the town looked at me like I was a pariah, the traitorous daughter who had bitten the hand that fed her. I heard the whispers in the grocery store aisle. She ruined her own father, and she destroyed this town just to make a point. To them, loyalty was a suicide pact, and I had broken the seal. But then there were the others, the quiet ones, the small business owners who had been denied loans while Ryan's shell companies thrived, the neighbors who had seen their savings dwindle. They didn't shout, but they slipped notes into my mailbox at night. "Thank you for telling the truth," one read. "I thought I was crazy when my rates changed overnight. You saved us." It was a crash course in the reality of American values. I saw the stark difference between the performative family loyalty my father preached and the actual hunger for justice that lived in the people he had exploited. My own legal journey was exhausted but vindicating. I spent hours in sterile government offices giving detailed statements to federal investigators. For the first time, my technical expertise wasn't treated as a threat or a secretarial convenience. It was treated as a vital asset. With the clear logs and the audio recording of the ambush, I was fully cleared of any wrongdoing. Aunt Gloria came out of her self-imposed exile to help me navigate the pro bono legal support, standing beside me like a sentinel. Marcus's reporting became the definitive record of the scandal, his articles cutting through the rumors to lay out the mathematical reality of the fraud. The final severance from my old life came in the form of a phone call. It was my mother. When I answered, her voice oscillated wildly between a wailing victim and a cold accuser. "How could you do this to him?" she sobbed, the sound tinny through the receiver. "You've destroyed everything your grandparents built. The reputation, the house, it's all gone." Then the tone shifted, sharpening into a threat. "We'll sue you for defamation. We have lawyers." And then just as quickly she collapsed into a plea. "Please, Beatrice, you have to talk to the judge. Tell them it was a mistake. Help us." I listened to the woman who had sat silently on the sofa while her husband planned to send me to prison. I felt a phantom ache in my chest, but it was old pain like a scar stretching in cold weather. "You can't sue me with the truth, Mom," I said quietly. "You're ungrateful," she spat. "After everything we did for you." "You both tried to erase me," I interrupted, my voice steady. "I'm just refusing to disappear." I hung up before she could respond. I sat there for a long time, sobbing into my hands, but it wasn't the desperate, panicked crying of a child. It was the heavy, clearing rain that comes after a fever breaks. It was grief, yes, but it was a grief that made room for oxygen. I left town 2 weeks later. I couldn't stay in the blast crater. I moved to Denver, craving the anonymity of a city and the sight of mountains that were too big to care about the name Collins. I used my savings to start a small cybersecurity consultancy. I didn't want corporate contracts. I specialized in protecting whistleblowers, nonprofits, and community banks from internal fraud. I built an office that was the antithesis of my father's boardroom: glass walls, open books, and a culture where integrity was practiced, not just printed on brochures. Marcus came with me. Our relationship didn't have the frantic energy of a teenage romance. It was grounded, solid. He treated me as an equal, celebrating my independence rather than feeling threatened by it. We argued sometimes about whose turn it was to walk the dog or what to order for dinner, but there was never that coercive, manipulative undercurrent I had grown up believing was love. I was learning to choose partners who didn't look at me and see a utility. Years slipped by, layering over the past like sediment. Then on a Tuesday afternoon, I went to check the mail at my office. Mixed in with the bills and client contracts was a plain white envelope. The stamp was from a federal correctional facility. The handwriting was unmistakable, sharp, jagged, vertical strokes. Douglas Collins. There was no return address, just the stamp. And on the front, centered in the white space, was a single word: Beatrice. For a long time, all I ever wanted was a letter from my father that started with my name. Now that I had one, I wasn't sure if I would open it. 7 years is a lifetime in the world of code, but it turns out to be just enough time to rebuild a human being, too. I was 35 now, living in a converted loft in Denver that hummed with the quiet energy of servers and the smell of strong coffee. My consultancy had grown from a one-woman show into a firm of 12, but my real pride was the small, separate project I ran on the side, a nonprofit grant program offering legal and technical defense to employees who were being scapegoated by their superiors. I called it the Override Fund. It was my way of ensuring that the next time a Douglas Collins tried to sacrifice a spare daughter, she would have armor. One Tuesday afternoon, I sat at my desk watching a video message from one of our recent grant recipients. She was a 19-year-old girl from Ohio whose parents had kicked her out for refusing to help them falsify tax returns for their failing business. On the screen, she looked tired but determined, holding up an acceptance letter to a state university. "My parents told me I'd be nothing without them," she said, her voice cracking just a little. "They said I was ungrateful. But your program, it proved them wrong. I'm not nothing. I'm just free." I paused the video, feeling a deep, quiet satisfaction settle in my chest. It was the antithesis of what my parents had tried to do to me. They had tried to erase people to save themselves. I was helping people write themselves back into existence. I closed the laptop and opened the top drawer of my desk. The letter was still there. I had kept the envelope from the federal prison for over a year without opening it, letting it sit like a paperweight on my past. Today, the weight felt light enough to lift. I slid my finger under the flap and unfolded the cheap lined paper. The handwriting was unmistakably Douglas's sharp, jagged still, trying to command space even from a cell. I read it quickly. It was a masterclass in deflection, a mix of excuses and self-pity wrapped in the guise of wisdom. He complained about his lawyer, about the food, about the unfairness of the judge. And then the final manipulation saved for the last paragraph. You'll understand when you're a parent, Beatrice. Everything I did for the family. One day you'll see that. I felt a flash of the old anger, but it fizzled out almost instantly, replaced by a profound pity. He still didn't get it. He truly believed that destroying his child was an act of love for the family, as if the family were a corporate entity separate from the people inside it. I took a pen and wrote a single line on the bottom of his letter: "Real parents don't erase their children to save themselves." I looked at it for a moment, then folded the paper. I didn't mail it. He wouldn't understand it anyway, and I didn't need him to. Writing it was the period at the end of the sentence. I dropped the letter into the shredder and watched my father's words turn into confetti. A few months later, I had reason to drive through my hometown on the way to a client site. I hadn't planned to stop, but gravity pulled me toward the town square. It looked smaller than I remembered, as places from childhood always do. The bank was still there, standing on the corner of Main and Elm, but the gold Collins Community Bank lettering was gone, replaced by a modest blue sign that read River Valley Credit Union. The empire was dead. I drove past slowly. A few people on the sidewalk glanced at my car. One older woman frowned, recognizing the profile of a Collins, but a man coming out of the hardware store, someone whose small business had nearly been ruined by my father's schemes, gave me a short, solemn nod. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't hatred. It was just acknowledgement. I drove past the big house on the hill, now owned by a tech entrepreneur from the coast, and finally parked by the lake where my grandfather used to take me fishing. It was the only place that felt like mine. I sat on the hood of the car, breathing in the scent of pine and damp earth, realizing that the town didn't haunt me anymore. It was just a place on a map. When I got back to Denver, the house was full of noise. Aunt Gloria was there, arguing good-naturedly with Marcus about the correct way to season a brisket. Two of my mentees were on the patio, debating the merits of a new encryption protocol. This was my family now. It wasn't inherited. It was built. It was messy and loud, and founded on the radical idea that love is something you do, not something you owe. Marcus walked over and handed me a drink, pressing a kiss to my temple. "You okay?" he asked, sensing the ghost of the trip on me. "Yeah," I said, leaning into him. "I'm better than okay." I walked out to the edge of the patio, looking over the city lights spread out below us. A rescue dog we'd adopted, a scruffy terrier mix named Audit, trotted up and sat by my feet. I thought about the trajectory of my life, the cold conference room, the ambush in the living room, the threat to erase me. My parents had tried to sacrifice me to protect a hollow image of the name Collins. But in doing so, they had given me the tools to dismantle that image and build something real in its place. The name Collins didn't mean fraud or betrayal anymore. To the people in this room and the people I helped, it meant resilience. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Another notification from the override fund. Another person asking for help to tell the truth. I smiled and let the message wait, just watching the horizon for a moment. My parents tried to ambush me, to sacrifice me, to threaten to erase me for the sake of their version of family. Instead, they did something they never intended. They forced me to finally choose myself. And once I did, they were never in charge of my story again. And that is the moment Beatrice finally claimed her own name, exchanging a toxic legacy for a life of purpose. What would you have done after that betrayal? Tell us in the comments below. We read every single one of your thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey of defiance and justice served, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.